Imagine, if you will, being the absolute best at your job.
Okay.
And I don't mean just good. I mean like flawless. You are the gold standard.
The absolute pinnacle.
Exactly. So in this scenario, you are the CEO of a massive industry-dominating corporation, and you do everything the business textbooks tell you to do.
You're following the rules.
To the letter. You listen perfectly to your clients. You anticipate their future needs through, rigorous market research. You invest billions, literally billions, into the best R&D. You hire the sharpest engineers from top universities, and you execute without a single operational mistake. Like, you are the darling of Wall Street. Forbes is putting you on their cover.
Sounds like a pretty good gig.
It does. But then imagine that very exact behavior, doing everything perfectly right, following the golden rules of management, is the specific mechanical reason you completely and utterly fail.
Yeah, that's the kicker.
Your company doesn't just stumble. It is entirely wiped off the map by a competitor making what looks like a cheap, inferior toy.
It sounds like an impossible riddle, honestly.
It really does.
Because we are conditioned from day one in business school, and frankly just in life, to believe that success is the direct result of listening to the people who pay you.
Right. Customer is always right.
Exactly. You listen to them, and you improve your products for them. So the idea that this exact loop is a fatal trap, it's deeply unsettling.
Well, welcome to this deep dive, where our mission today is to unpack this mind-bending reality. It's known as the Innovator's Dilemma.
Yes.
And we are pulling from the groundbreaking foundational research of Clayton M. Christensen today. The sources we are exploring prove that the very principles of quote-unquote good management.
The things that get executives those massive bonuses.
Right. Those exact things are often what cause great Titan-level companies to collapse when they're faced with a very specific type of technological change.
Very specific vulnerability.
And I have to admit, reading through this research, I found myself in a state of sheer disbelief. I mean, it breaks literally everything we think we know about business success.
It does. It completely flips the script.
Because how can the flawless execution of perfect strategy actually be the mechanism of your own destruction? It makes no sense.
That disbelief is the totally natural first reaction. The premise is incredibly counterintuitive. But as we dig into the historical data today across multiple completely unrelated industries...
Right, it's not just one sector.
No, not at all. The pattern becomes this inescapable mathematical reality.
Yeah.
But we have to clarify up front here.
Okay, what's the clarification?
We aren't talking about companies that got lazy or arrogant or bogged down in bureaucracy.
Because that's the usual story, right? Like, oh, they got too big and stopped caring.
Right. The autopsy reports of these fallen giants, they usually claim they, fell asleep at the wheel.
Yeah.
But the data shows the exact opposite.
Wow.
We are talking about the absolute best of the best. Companies that had their competitive antenna up, that invested aggressively, and that listened astutely to their customers.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because I need some concrete examples here. Usually when a giant falls, the narrative is exactly that they stopped innovating, they just milked their cash cows.
Right.
So what kind of perfect companies are we actually talking about?
Let's look at Sears. Sears, Roebuck and Company.
Okay, Sears.
For decades, they were universally regarded as one of the most astutely managed retailers in the entire world.
Yeah, they were massive.
At their absolute zenith, Sears accounted for more than 2% of all retail sales in the United States.
2% of the entire country's retail. That's insane.
Just a staggering number. And they didn't just participate in retail. They pioneered the innovations that today's massive retailers completely rely on.
Like what?
Well, they essentially invented modern supply chain management. They pioneered store brands, they perfected catalog retailing, and they were at the absolute forefront of credit card sales.
So they were basically the Amazon of their era.
Absolutely.
They built the infrastructure of modern commerce.
They did. And in the mid-1960s, there was this Fortune magazine article that praised them. It said they had no gimmicks, no tricks, just an organization that simply did the right thing easily and naturally.
High praise.
But right when they were receiving these massive accolades, at the absolute height of their operational perfection, they were entirely missing the advent of discount retailing and home centers.
Oh, wow. So they missed the Walmarts.
They completely missed companies like Walmart and Home Depot. By the 1990s, Sears was losing billions.
Billions with a B.
Yep. And the business press pivoted, obviously, and accused them of letting arrogance blind them. But the historical reality is to the decisions that led to their decline.
Like fatal choices.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Those decisions were made when they were widely praised as paragons of managerial excellence. They were doing everything, quote, right.
The sources mention tech giants, too, which is where things get really fast and brutal, I think, like IBM.
IBM's a perfect example.
They completely dominated the mainframe computer market. They were the untouchable titan. But they missed the emergence of mini-computers by years.
By a wide margin. Yeah.
And the company that created that mini-computer market, Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC,
Right, DC.
they became this unstoppable force in their own right. I remember reading that in the 1980s, people were saying taking on DEC was like standing in front of a moving train.
They were terrifying to competitors.
Yeah. They were even featured as the ultimate case study in that famous management book, In Search of Excellence.
But just a few years after being heralded as that ultimate management success story, DEC was described by the financial press as a company in need of triage.
Wow. From moving train to triage.
Because they completely missed the desktop personal computer market. The moving train literally derailed, and the cycle just continued. The makers of desktop computers missed portable computers. The makers of portables missed the next wave.
It really is. It's like a straight-A student who fails the final exam because they spent, 100 hours studying perfectly for the exact wrong syllabus.
That is a phenomenal analogy.
They have all the skills, all the discipline, the raw intelligence, but they are applying it with terrifying efficiency in a paradigm that is just no longer relevant to the tests they're about to take.
To understand the mechanics of why this happens, why that straight-A student fails so spectacularly, we need to introduce the fundamental framework from Christensen's text.
Okay, let's lay the groundwork.
We must separate technological changes into two very distinct categories: sustaining technologies and disruptive technologies.
Sustaining and disruptive.
Right. And the failure to distinguish between these two is exactly what kills the giants.
Let's define the first one then. What are the specific characteristics of a sustaining technology?
A sustaining technology is an innovation that makes existing products better for existing mainstream customers.
Okay. Better for the people already buying it.
Exactly. They improve product performance along the specific dimensions that the current market already values.
So faster, cheaper, stronger.
Yes. And these improvements can be incremental, like a slightly faster microchip, or they can be radically difficult, requiring massive leaps in engineering and physics.
Oh, so it's not about how hard the tech is to build.
No, not at all. The defining feature is not the difficulty. The key is that it gives your best customers more of what they're already asking for.
Okay, I want to make sure I have this locked in. So if I'm a major car manufacturer today, a sustaining technology might be a dramatically more fuel-efficient internal combustion engine.
Yeah.
It might require billions in R&D, new metal alloys, incredibly complex software to manage fuel injection. It's really, really hard to engineer, but it gives my current customers exactly what they are already demanding: better gas mileage and more horsepower.
That is a perfect encapsulation, yes.
Okay, I've got sustaining.
Now, contrast that with a disruptive technology. These are innovations that, at least in the near term, result in worse product performance in the established market.
Wait, worse?
Yes. They actually underperform the existing products along the dimensions that mainstream customers care about most.
So why would anyone build them?
Because they introduce a completely different package of attributes. They're usually cheaper, simpler, smaller, and frequently more convenient to use.
Okay.
But because they underperform on those traditional metrics, mainstream customers generally don't want them at all. Instead, they are highly valued by a fringe or an entirely new customer base.
So the disruptive technology is actually objectively worse at doing the main job the industry currently measures.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is that leading firms almost always win when it comes to sustaining technologies, no matter how technically difficult, expensive, or risky they are.
Because they have the resources.
Right. The giants have the money, the engineers, the incentive. But they almost always lose when confronted with disruptive ones. Even if the disruptive technology is simple and consists of cheap, off-the-shelf components.
That is wild. They can invent new physics, but they can't put cheap parts in a smaller box.
Because the established companies stumble, not because the tech is too hard to engineer, but because it is mathematically irrational for them to invest in something their best customers actively reject, and which promises lower profit margins.
I can hear a skeptic right now saying, sure, this sounds like a neat sociological theory, but business is about execution.
Showing the numbers.
Exactly. So to really see this invisible trap in action, the sources point us toward an industry that evolves so incredibly fast, it's basically the biological equivalent of a fruit fly.
The fruit flies of business.
Yeah, because if you want to study genetics, you look at fruit flies. Because their life cycles are so short, you can see evolutionary mutations in days rather than millennia.
Hmm.
In the business world, the fruit flies are the hard disk drive industry.
The disk drive industry provides the absolute perfect laboratory for this research. The pace of change there is just breathtaking. It condenses decades of industrial evolution into a few short years.
How fast are we talking?
Between 1976 and 1995, the value of drives produced rose from about $1 billion to $18 billion.
Okay, massive growth.
Massive. But the corporate mortality rate accompanying that growth was staggering. Of the 17 firms operating in 1976, all except IBM's internal operation had failed or been acquired by 1995.
Almost a complete wipeout.
And of the 129 firms that entered the industry during that period, 109 of them failed.
That is a corporate bloodbath.
It really is.
And the technological progress driving it is just absurd. Sources mentioned an experience curve with a 53% slope. I want to spend a second here so we don't just gloss over the math. What does a 53% slope on an experience curve actually mean in the physical world of manufacturing?
All right, let's break that down. In manufacturing economics, an experience curve measures how much the cost of producing a unit decreases as your cumulative production volume increases.
Okay, so the more you make, the cheaper it gets.
Exactly. A 53% slope means that with every doubling of the cumulative terabytes of disk storage capacity shipped in the entire history of the industry,
Every time total capacity doubled.
the cost per megabyte fell to 53% of its former level.
Wow. Almost half the price.
To put that in perspective for the average consumer, the price per megabyte dropped by 5% per quarter for more than 20 years.
5% every 3 months. That's relentless.
Meanwhile, the physical size of a 20 megabyte drive shrank from 800 cubic inches in 1978 to just 1.4 cubic inches in 1993.
Okay, with a pace like that, my immediate thought is that these companies failed simply because the tech was moving too fast to keep up with.
It's a common assumption.
It's like trying to climb a mudslide. You scramble with everything you have, you claw your way up, but if you pause for 1 second to catch your breath, the mud just buries you.
Was the sheer velocity of technological change the culprit here? Like the mudslide hypothesis?
The mudslide hypothesis is incredibly compelling, but the historical data completely debunks it.
Really? It wasn't the pace.
No. The established firms didn't fail because they couldn't keep up with the hard science. In fact, they were the ones leading the most difficult, radical technological leaps in the history of the industry.
What kind of leaps? Because we need to understand the physics of what they were actually building to appreciate how capable they were.
Let's look at the transition to what is called Winchester architecture in the 1970s. And then later, the jump to thin-film read-write heads.
Okay, what is Winchester architecture?
Early hard drives were massive. And the read-write heads, those are the tiny magnets that hover over the spinning disk. To read the data, they flew relatively high above the surface.
If a speck of dust got in, it would cause a catastrophic head crash. It would destroy the drive.
Yikes.
So IBM introduced Winchester architecture, which involved incredibly low-mass heads flying micro-inches above a lubricated platter, all sealed within an airtight environment.
So they completely sealed it off from dust.
Yes. And this allowed them to pack data much more densely.
And that sounds like a massive engineering challenge to manufacture at scale.
It was incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
But the jump to thin film heads was even harder.
Okay, what's a thin film head?
Previously, engineers made read-write heads by physically winding microscopic copper wires around tiny ferrite cores.
Like by hand.
Literally building tiny electromagnets by hand, or with really complex winding machines. But as they needed to pack data closer together, these ferrite heads became too bulky.
They couldn't get them small enough.
Right. So the industry had to figure out how to borrow photolithography techniques from the semiconductor industry.
Wait, photolithography?
Yes. They had to learn how to use light to etch microscopic electromagnets onto silicon rather than winding wires.
Oh, wow. So they are essentially printing magnets with light.
Exactly. And the pioneer companies, firms like IBM and Control Data, each spent more than 8 years and over $100 million developing this thin film technology.
They spent $100 million in 1980s dollars to invent a new way of printing magnets with light.
Yes. It was incredibly risky, complex, and pushed the boundaries of material science.
And they actually pulled it off.
They executed it flawlessly. They led the industry over this massive technological hurdle because it was a sustaining technology.
there's that word again, sustaining.
Right. It allowed them to pack more megabytes onto a disk, which is exactly what their mainstream mainframe computer customers were screaming for. In the language of technology strategy, they successfully navigated positive discontinuities on the technology S-curve.
Let's define that S-curve concept quickly for the listener.
Sure, the technology S-curve shows the life cycle of an innovation. Progress is slow at first, as engineers figure out the basics. That's the bottom of the S.
Makes sense.
Then it hits a period of rapid improvement, the steep middle section. Finally, it hits physical or engineering limits and plateaus the top of the S.
Okay, I can picture that.
The established companies were brilliant at jumping from the top of an old S-curve, like ferret heads, onto the bottom of a new S-curve, like thin film heads, just in time to ride the next wave of rapid improvement.
So they were agile.
Very agile. In every single instance of sustaining technology change in the disk drive industry, established firms led in development and commercialization. The entrants, the startups, they were always the followers trying to catch up on the hard science.
Wait, stop. I'm stuck on something. This is the part that breaks my brain.
Okay, what is it?
If I am the CEO of a company with the engineering muscle to invent microscopic thin film heads through photolithography, and I have a $100 million R&D budget, why couldn't I survive?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because if the industry started with massive 14-inch diameter discs and then moved to 8-inch, then 5.25-inch, and down to 3.5-inch, shrinking the drive just seems like a packaging problem.
It does seem that way.
If you own the superior thin film technology, why don't you just tell your engineers to put that superior tech into a smaller 8-inch box? I just don't buy that they missed it or couldn't figure out how to make it smaller.
You are hitting on the exact paradox. Technologically, shrinking the drive was simple. It didn't require photolithography or breaking new ground in physics.
Right.
The smaller drives generally use standard, off-the-shelf components. The asymmetry between the new entrants who championed the smaller drives and the incumbents who ignored them wasn't about engineering capability.
Then what was it about?
It was entirely about what their respective customers valued. Let's look at it from the perspective of an established manufacturer making 14-inch drives in the late 1970s.
Okay, I'm the manufacturer.
Your customers are mainframe computer makers. These machines take up entire rooms. The customers want massive data capacity, and they want the lowest possible cost per megabyte.
Because they are processing payroll for 1 million employees, they need raw storage space above all else. Size doesn't matter.
Precisely. Now, along comes the first generation of the 8-inch drive. It's smaller physically, yes. But a mainframe computer manufacturer doesn't care if the disk drive is 14 inches or 8 inches. They have plenty of floor space.
It's in a server farm somewhere.
Exactly. What they do care about is that the early 8-inch drives had significantly less total capacity than the 14-inch drives. And because the manufacturing processes weren't scaled yet, they actually cost more per megabyte.
Oh.
So if you are the incumbent firm, you take this 8-inch prototype to your best mainframe customers, and they explicitly reject it. It offers them less of what they need at a higher price to solve a space problem they don't have.
Wow. Okay, so the CEO of the established firm looks at the data, listens to their best clients, and says, okay, our customers actively hate this. It's an inferior product with worse financial metrics. Let's redirect our R&D money back into making our 14-inch drives faster and bigger, which is what the people writing us checks actually want.
Yes.
That is a 100% rational management decision.
It is the only decision a responsible executive could make. Meanwhile, the entrant firms, who are pioneering the 8-inch drives, have no mainframe customers to satisfy.
Because they're locked out of that market.
Right, they're locked out because their product isn't good enough yet. So they are forced to find a market that does value the smaller physical size.
And where did they find it?
They find it in the emerging mini-computer market. Mini-computers were smaller, desk-side machines. The 14-inch drives were literally too large to fit inside the mini-computer casing.
Oh, it was a physical constraint.
Yes. Therefore, the mini-computer makers were willing to pay a premium for the 8-inch drives, despite their lower total capacity and higher cost per megabyte, because the physical size was the gating feature that allowed their product to exist.
And once the entrants establish a foothold in that new mini-computer market, what happens to the trajectory of the technology?
That is where the trap snaps shut on the incumbent. The entrants, now profitable and growing alongside the booming mini-computer market, start applying those same sustaining technologies to their 8-inch drives.
They start making them better.
Exactly. They figure out how to pack more capacity onto them. And crucially, the trajectory of technological improvement is almost always steeper than the trajectory of what the market actually demands.
The tech outpaces the need.
Right. So the 8-inch drives get better faster than the mainframe market needs its storage to get better. Eventually, the 8-inch drives cross a threshold. They become reliable enough, cheap enough, and hold enough data to satisfy the lower end of the massive mainframe market.
They invade from below.
Exactly.
The mainframe makers look down and realize the 8-inch drive is now, quote-unquote, good enough for their needs. Plus, it takes up less space and uses less power.
And by the time the 14-inch drive makers realize the 8-inch drives are an existential threat to their core business, the entrants have built up an insurmountable advantage in manufacturing volume, design experience, and cost structure.
So it's too late.
It's way too late. The data from the sources is chilling here. 2/3 of the 14-inch manufacturers never even introduced an 8-inch model. Every single one of them was eventually driven from the industry.
It's just a brutal sequence of events. To really ground this in human decision-making, we need to drag out the financial math. Let's look at one specific company's story from the sources to see this play out in the boardroom. Let's zoom in on Seagate Technology.
Seagate is a phenomenal example of this exact dynamic. They were the dominant manufacturer of 5.25-inch drives, which were the standard storage component for desktop personal computers.
Okay.
By the mid-1980s, they were an absolute juggernaut in that space, shipping millions of units.
And then the 3.5-inch drive comes along the size that would eventually become the standard for laptops. Now, the sources note something critical here. Seagate didn't miss the 3.5-inch drive because they were blind to it or technically incompetent. In fact, their own engineers built working prototypes.
Yes. Seagate's engineering organization built about 80 working models of the 3.5-inch drive in early 1985.
80 of them.
This was before senior management was even formally involved in a commercialization push. The engineers just saw the potential of the smaller form factor and tinkered with it. The technology was absolutely not the problem. They had the physical drives sitting on their desks.
So what happened? How do you have the future literally sitting on your desk and still manage to bankrupt your future? Walk us through the fatal market test.
The marketing team at Seagate took what they thought was the logical, responsible next step. They took these 3.5-inch prototypes to their lead customers, which were companies like IBM, who manufactured the massive XT and AT-class desktop computers.
So they went to the people buying the most stuff.
Right. The marketing team presented the drive and asked, "Do you want to buy this?" IBM evaluated and said no.
Explain the logic of IBM's rejection. Why didn't they want a smaller drive?
Because IBM was projecting the needs of their next-generation desktop machines. They knew their users needed 40 to 60 megabytes of capacity to run the emerging, heavier software applications.
And the 3.5-inch prototypes?
The new 3.5-inch prototypes could only hold 20 megabytes.
Oh, half of what they needed.
Exactly. Furthermore, because the 3.5-inch manufacturing lines hadn't achieved economies of scale yet, they would initially cost more per megabyte to manufacture than the mature 5.25-inch drives.
Right, because they're making fewer of them.
Exactly. So from IBM's perspective, Seagate was offering them a drive that had half the capacity they needed at a higher relative cost to save a few inches of space inside a huge desktop chassis where space wasn't an issue at all.
They had absolutely no use for it.
No.
Okay, so that's the customer's perspective. But let's look at Seagate's internal financial perspective. It was a completely rational rejection in the boardroom too, wasn't it?
It really was.
Break down the financial math of the margins for us, because I think this is where the knife really twists.
It was entirely mathematically rational. Seagate's financial analysts looked at the market projections. The established market for 5.25-inch drives with 60 to 100 megabytes was projected to reach $500 million by 1987.
$500 million.
More importantly, companies serving that mature market were generating gross margins of 35 to 40%.
That's a huge margin for hardware.
And those high margins were absolutely necessary to absorb Seagate's massive corporate overhead. Their huge R&D labs, their global sales force, their existing manufacturing footprint.
Right. You need fat margins to pay for all those engineers and facilities.
The 3.5-inch drives, on the other hand, were targeted at the unproven, nascent laptop computer market. In 1985, laptops were barely a concept.
Yeah, they were like heavy briefcases.
Exactly. The sales forecasts for that entire market were tiny, less than $50 million. And because it was an emerging market, the pricing pressure was intense, meaning the profit margins would be significantly lower, maybe 20%.
So what does this all mean? The irony is just suffocating. Staying close to your customer is the ultimate business mantra.
The golden rule.
You hear it at every corporate retreat, you read it in every Harvard Business Review article. Listen to your clients. But that exact philosophy is what caused Seagate to miss the boat. They were essentially held captive by IBM's needs.
Captive is the perfect word.
Because if a Seagate executive had stood up and said, hey, let's divert millions of dollars away from our $500 million 40% margin business to chase a $50 million 20% margin business for a product our best customer actively hates.
They would have been fired on the spot.
Right. Fired for gross managerial incompetence.
They absolutely would have. So they rationally shelved the 3.5-inch project. They canceled the program and redirected those engineering hours into accelerating the introduction of new 5.25-inch models.
Sustaining innovation.
Packing them with complex, sustaining technologies to fight off their current competitors and satisfy IBM.
Wow.
But while Seagate was doing exactly what they were supposed to do, the entrance path was being aggressively forged by a startup called Connor Peripherals.
And here is the ultimate twist. Connor Peripherals was started by ex-Seagate employees. You literally cannot write a better script than this.
It's amazing. Frustrated engineers and executives who saw the potential of the 3.5-inch drive defected from Seagate. They started Connor Peripherals, and because IBM wouldn't talk to them, they took the 3.5-inch drive to a completely new customer, Compaq. Compaq was in the process of pioneering the portable computer market, and Compaq didn't care that the 3.5-inch drives had lower total capacity or cost more per megabyte than a desktop drive.
Right on.
For a portable computer, the critical non-negotiable attributes were ruggedness, low power consumption, and most importantly, a lightweight, small physical footprint.
The exact things the 3.5-inch drive was good at.
Exactly. The 3.5-inch drive was the only technology that allowed Compaq's product to exist.
And how did that financial math work out for Connor Peripherals?
Spectacularly well. In their first full year of operation, Connor booked $113 million in revenues.
In year one.
Year one. It was a record for the fastest growth of any manufacturing company in United States history at the time.
That is unbelievable.
They completely dominated the new portable computing market. And then, following the exact same biological pattern we've been discussing, they kept applying sustaining innovations to their own technology.
They made it better and cheaper.
They figured out how to pack more capacity onto the 3.5-inch discs while driving the manufacturing costs down. The performance trajectory went straight up, improving faster than the market demanded, until it eventually intersected with the minimum capacity needs of the massive desktop market.
At which point, the desktop computer makers, Seagate's best customers, the ones who previously rejected the drive, looked at the new 3.5-inch specs and said, hey, these smaller drives are now fast enough, they hold 60 megabytes, and they use less power and take up less space. We want to switch our desktop production over to these.
Exactly. And by 1988, Seagate was finally forced to swallow their pride and start shipping 3.5-inch drives, largely just to defend their core desktop turf from the entrance.
But the damage was already done.
The damage was done. They'd completely missed the massive growth phase of the new portable laptop market. By 1991, almost none of Seagate's 3.5-inch products had been sold to portable laptop manufacturers. They were just playing a desperate game of defense in their home market.
But why does this keep happening over and over? The sources show it wasn't just 14-inch to 8-inch or 5.25 to 3.5. It happened again when the industry moved to 2.5-inch drives for notebooks and 1.8-inch drives for handhelds.
It's a relentless cycle.
Why couldn't these massive companies with brilliant analysts just learn the lesson and pivot? I mean, is it just deep-seated corporate stubbornness?
It is a mistake to label it stubbornness. It is about the invisible ecosystem they live in, which constrains their actions.
The ecosystem.
The text calls this foundational concept a value network. And understanding the physics of the value network is really the master key to unlocking the innovator's dilemma.
So it's not just about the gadget itself. It sounds like they are trapped by their own ecosystem, their suppliers, their margins, their sales reps. Is that what the text means by a value network?
A value network is the nested commercial system within which a firm identifies and responds to customer needs. It's how they solve problems, procure input, react to competitors, and strive for profit.
Okay, so it's the whole web.
It is the invisible web of economic relationships and cost structures that dictates what a company can and cannot do. Crucially, the value network defines exactly how value is measured and rewarded.
Give us a concrete example of how these metrics of value differ so wildly between networks. Like, how does one network value something totally differently than another?
Well, the sources utilize a fascinating statistical technique called hedonic regression analysis.
Hedonic regression analysis. Okay, break that down for us.
This analysis breaks down the total price of a product into the implied mathematical value of its individual features.
Okay, so how much each part is worth?
Right. So if we look at the mainframe computer value network in 1988, the hedonic regression analysis reveals that a mainframe customer was willing to pay an additional $1.65 for every extra megabyte of capacity.
Okay, $1.65 per megabyte.
But they would pay exactly $0 for a cubic inch of size reduction. Size simply did not exist as a metric of value in that network.
It was worthless to them, but if you run that same statistical analysis on the portable computing value network,
The metrics are completely inverted. Portable computing customers place a massive, quantifiable premium on size reduction. They would pay a high price for every single cubic inch saved.
because laptops have to be small.
Exactly. But they were willing to pay much less, only about $1.17, for an incremental megabyte of capacity. The definition of better fundamentally changes depending on which network you reside in.
But it goes deeper than just ranking product features, right? Because the real trap is the fundamental cost structure of these businesses. Let's talk about overhead absorption, because I think that's the killer.
If we connect this to the bigger financial picture, cost structure is the steel cage of the value network. Competing in the mainframe value network required astronomical research and development budgets to push the boundaries of physics.
Right.
It required massive direct sales forces to sell complicated million-dollar machines to corporate IT departments and extensive global field service networks to maintain them.
You need an army of people.
Yes. And to generate enough cash to cover those immense overhead costs, manufacturers of 14-inch drives needed gross profit margins of 50 to 60%.
60% gross margins just to keep the lights on and pay the engineers.
Yes. But competing in the desktop or portable value network was a totally different economic reality.
How so?
Those products were largely assembled from standard, off-the-shelf parts manufactured in massive volumes in lower-cost regions and sold through third-party retail chains.
Oh, they didn't have to sell direct to IT departments.
No, they didn't need huge R&D labs or direct sales forces. So companies operating in those networks could be highly profitable and grow exponentially with gross margins of just 15 to 30%.
Wow. I want to relate this to something everyone listening can instantly picture.
Please do.
It's like a high-end white tablecloth steakhouse trying to pivot to selling $2 street tacos.
Oh, I love this analogy.
Right. Now, the street tacos might represent a massive, exploding demographic of hungry late-night diners. It's an undeniable growth market. But the steakhouse has imported crystal chandeliers. They have a world-class sommelier on staff, expensive linen service, and a prime real estate lease in the financial district.
Their overhead is
The
massive.
sheer overhead, the cost structure of their high-end value network makes it mathematically impossible for them to sell a $2 taco and turn a profit. They would literally bankrupt themselves trying to capture the new market because the margins on the taco cannot absorb the cost of the chandelier.
That is exactly it.
Their capabilities as a luxury steakhouse entirely define their disabilities in the street food market.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the structural rigidity of the dilemma. When an established firm's executives look down market at an emerging disruptive technology, their financial analysts tell them, look, we need 50% margins to cover our structural overhead, but this new technology only offers 20% margins.
So they can't do it.
Pursuing it isn't just risky. It is a violation of their fiduciary duty to shareholders.
Wow.
The very processes, cost structures, and values that make an organization wildly successful in its current network render it physically incapable of addressing a disruptive threat from below.
This structural blindness leads to a very predictable cycle. And the sources outline 6 steps of managerial failure.
They do.
I want to walk through these slowly because it feels like watching a Greek tragedy where the hero's fatal flaw guarantees their doom from the very first act.
It is a remarkably consistent pattern. Step 1. The disruptive technology is actually developed internally by the established firm.
Wait, really? The big guys invented?
Often, yes. The incumbent engineers are brilliant. They see the new tech, they tinker with it, usually assembling it from off-the-shelf components.
Just like Seagate's engineers building 80 working prototypes of the 3.5-inch drive on their own time, they literally have the future in their hands.
Exactly. That leads to step 2. The marketing team gets involved. They take these raw prototypes and seek reactions from their lead customers.
the steakhouse customer.
Yes. The customers whose needs are entirely entrenched in the old high-performance value network say, no, thank you, this doesn't do what we need. It's too slow, it doesn't hold enough data.
Yeah.
They reject it rationally.
So step 3 is where the incumbent doubles down on the past, right?
Step 3, the established firm shelves the disruptive project and steps up the pace of sustaining technological development.
Making the steak better.
They throw their engineering resources into making their current products better for their current customers. It feels safer. The customers exist, their needs are quantifiable, the revenue is predictable, and the margins are healthy enough to support the stock price.
Meanwhile, the outcasts take the stage. Step 4.
Step 4. New companies are formed. They're very often founded by frustrated engineers who defected from the established firms.
Yeah.
Because these startups have no existing customer base to appease and no massive overhead to support, they are forced to find entirely new markets. They do this by trial and error, eventually discovering a new, emerging value network that actually prizes the unique, previously undesirable attributes of the disruptive technology.
Like Connor Peripherals finding Compaq and realizing that ruggedness and size matter more than total capacity for a laptop.
Precisely.
Then comes step 5, the invasion.
Step 5. The entrants move upmarket. Once they establish a secure, profitable base in their new market, they adopt sustaining innovations of their own. They pour their profits into R&D.
And their tech gets better.
Crucially, their technology improves at a faster rate than their market demands. Soon, the performance of the disruptive tech intersects with the lower-end needs of the established markets above them.
And the final nail in the coffin, step 6.
Step 6. The established firms belatedly realize the threat and jump on the bandwagon to defend their turf. But by now, it's far too late.
Because they're years behind.
The entrants have insurmountable advantages in manufacturing cost, economies of scale, and design experience. The established firms are forced into a brutal price war with competitors who possess cost structures explicitly designed to be profitable at much lower margins.
They can't win a price war against the street taco stand.
They can't. The established firms either fail completely or are relegated to a tiny, shrinking niche of ultra-high-end applications.
This sounds like a perfectly elegant theory when we are looking backward at the disk drive industry with the benefit of hindsight.
Hindsight is 20/20.
Right, it's easy to connect the dots when the ink is dry, but the real test of any business theory is if it can predict the future while it is still messy and uncertain.
Which is exactly what Christensen did.
Let's talk about the ultimate test case from the sources, flash memory.
Yes, when Christensen's research was being formalized in the early to mid-1990s, flash memory was just emerging as the next massive potential disruptive threat.
Okay, flash memory, like USB drives and stuff.
Flash memory is a solid-state semiconductor technology. It stores data electronically on silicon chips rather than magnetically on spinning physical platters.
So we are talking about the jump from physical moving parts motors, spinning disks, hovering magnetic heads, to purely electronic storage with zero moving parts.
A massive shift.
What were the specific attributes of early flash memory? Let's run it through our disruptive filter.
It fit the disruptive profile perfectly. On the positive side, it was incredibly rugged because there were no moving parts to break or crash. It consumed less than 5% of the power of an equivalent disk drive.
That's amazing.
But, as with all early disruptive technologies, it had severe performance drawbacks compared to the incumbent technology.
What were the drawbacks?
Depending on the capacity, the cost per megabyte for flash was between 5 and 50 times more expensive than disk memory.
50 times more expensive.
Up to 50 times, yes. Furthermore, early flash chips had a limited overwrite lifespan.
What does that mean?
The physical gates on the silicon would degrade and wear out after a few 100,000 writes, compared to a virtual infinity of writes for a magnetic disk drive.
Oh, wow. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of a desktop computer user in 1993. You don't care that your hard drive consumes a little more electricity from the wall outlet, or that it isn't rugged enough to survive being dropped off a 3-story building.
The desktop sits safely on a desk.
Exactly. And you certainly aren't going to pay 50 times more per megabyte for a drive that might literally wear out and lose your data if you save too many files. The mainstream market wanted absolutely nothing to do with it.
Exactly. So the initial value network for flash memory wasn't mainstream computing at all. It found its first footholds in devices like cellular phones, portable heart monitors, modems, and industrial robots.
Oh, that makes sense.
A traditional disk drive was too fragile to put in an industrial robot. It was too power-hungry for a cellular phone battery and simply too physically large. Flash was the only technology that enabled those products to exist.
This raises an important question, though. If major disk drive companies like Seagate and Quantum already know how to manufacture and program integrated circuits, because they were using massive amounts of silicon for the controller chips inside their disk drives,
Right, they had the expertise.
does that technological expertise guarantee they will win the flash memory race?
That is the exact academic debate the sources address. There's a prevailing theory in management called the capabilities viewpoint. It's championed by prominent scholars like Henderson, Clark, Tushman, and Anderson.
Okay, what does the capabilities viewpoint say?
It suggests that if a company has the underlying technological capability, the raw knowledge, the patents, the engineering skills, they will successfully navigate a technology shift.
Okay, that sounds logical.
Since companies like Seagate and Quantum had deep, world-class expertise in custom integrated circuit design, the capabilities viewpoint predicted they would easily transition to flash memory and dominate the new era.
But the value network theory looks at the exact same data and predicts something entirely different.
The value network framework argues that technological capability is totally irrelevant if the financial incentives are misaligned.
Back to the margins.
Always back to the margins. Even if Seagate and Quantum could engineer the greatest flash memory cards in the world, they would fail to commercialize them effectively because flash didn't fit the economic realities of their value network.
Right, because of their overhead.
They couldn't sell flash to their massive desktop and server customers because those customers wouldn't pay a 50 times premium for ruggedness they didn't need.
They didn't want the street taco.
Exactly. The established firms simply had no mechanism to allocate significant resources to a low-margin emerging market that accounted for 0% of their current revenue.
So the theories are pitted against each other in real time. What actually happened? Who was right?
The value network framework was perfectly predictive.
Wow.
Both Seagate and Quantum recognized the threat of flash, and they tried to enter the flash card market in the early 1990s through various partnerships and equity investments. But their efforts completely floundered because their best engineers and their capital were constantly being pulled back to defend their core, high-margin disk drive business against brutal price wars.
Oh, they couldn't focus on it.
They couldn't devote the sustained energy required to cultivate the low-margin, distant markets where flash was actually taking root. By 1995, neither company had captured even a 1% share of the flash card market, and both quietly withdrew their initial products.
That is incredible. The engineering capability was there, but the invisible cage of the value network constrained them perfectly.
It's a powerful cage.
I can hear that skeptic again, though. Okay, we spent an hour talking about Silicon Valley. It's easy to see how things move at light speed in the tech world where everything is just ones and zeros, and a startup in a garage can write new code. But what about industries where the physics don't change? You can't shrink a 10-ton boulder.
Right, the heavy industry argument.
Does this theory hold up in the dirt? What about massive, slow-moving, heavy industries?
That is the absolute beauty of Christensen's research design. To prove this isn't just a quirky, isolated phenomenon of the hyperfast microelectronics industry, the author analyzed the history of the mechanical excavator industry.
Mechanical excavators, like diggers.
Massive earth-moving equipment. Steam shovels, diesel tractors. It is an industry that moves with a completely different pace, a totally different capital structure, and completely different physical constraints.
You literally cannot get further from a microchip than a 10-ton steam shovel digging a canal. Walk us through the historical timeline here.
From the invention of the original steam shovel in 1837 all the way until the 1920s, mechanical earth-moving equipment was exclusively steam-powered.
Okay, steam power for almost a century.
Then came the first major technological upheaval, the transition from steam-powered to gasoline-powered internal combustion engines.
Now, changing a machine from a massive steam boiler with pipes, coal boxes, multiple small steam engines on each axle, over to a single central gasoline engine with a highly complex system of transmission gears and clutches. That sounds like a massive, radical change in the fundamental architecture of the product.
It was radically different technologically. It required entirely new engineering disciplines. But, and this is the crucial distinction we established earlier, it was a sustaining technology.
It was sustaining. Let's make sure we understand why.
Gasoline engines allowed contractors to do exactly what they were already doing, just better. It allowed them to move earth faster, more reliably, without needing a dedicated fireman to shovel coal, and at a lower overall operational cost than steam.
Ah, so it improved performance along the exact dimensions the mainstream market already valued. They just wanted to dig bigger holes faster.
Precisely.
Hmm.
So, based on our rules of disruptive innovation, if the gasoline engine is a sustaining technology, the established steam shovel firms should be the ones to win the market. They dominated it. The leading innovators in gasoline technology were the exact same dominant steam shovel companies, giants like Bucyrus and Marion.
Okay.
23 of the 25 largest makers of steam shovels successfully navigated the complex engineering transition to gasoline power. They maintained their market share and their dominance.
So the incumbents win the sustaining battle, just like in the disk drives.
Exactly. The exact same pattern held true when the industry subsequently moved to diesel engines and then to electric motors later on. These were all complex sustaining changes, and they were all successfully led by the wealthy incumbents.
The incumbents won the sustaining battles. So when did the disruption finally hit the dirt?
The true disruption arrived post-World War II with the emergence of hydraulics.
Hydraulics.
Up until this point, for over a century, the shovels were operated by incredibly complex systems of mechanical steel cables, pulleys, and winding drums. Then, companies started experimenting with hydraulically actuated systems using fluid pressure pumped into cylinders to extend and retract pistons to move the buckets.
But let me guess. The early hydraulics were terrible compared to the mature cable systems. We need to explain the physics here to understand why.
The physics of early hydraulics were incredibly limiting. A thick, woven steel cable connected to a massive winch can withstand immense tension. It can pull tons of rock without snapping.
Right. Steel cables are incredibly strong.
But a hydraulic system relies on seals and O-rings to contain the pressurized fluid. In the 1940s and 50s, seal technology was primitive.
Ah, they would leak.
If you tried to pump enough high-pressure fluid into a cylinder to lift a massive boulder, the seals would literally blow out and spray hydraulic fluid everywhere.
That's not ideal on a job site.
No. Therefore, the very first hydraulic excavators, which emerged in the late 40s, were inherently weak. The dominant cable-actuated machines of the 1950s, built by companies like Bucyrus, could hold up to 4 cubic yards of earth in a single scoop and could reach out incredibly far.
Massive machines.
The early hydraulic machines. They had a capacity of a mere 1/4 of a cubic yard, and their reach was limited to about 6 feet.
So if you take that tiny, weak hydraulic scoop to a general contractor who is digging a massive foundation for a skyscraper or a mining company trying to strip a mountain,
They would laugh you off the job site, just like the mainframe IT directors laughed at the 8-inch disk drive.
the exact same reaction.
The hydraulic machines were of absolutely no use to the mainstream market's mining, general excavation, and large-scale sewer contractors. The established value network demanded massive bucket capacity and long reach. Hydraulics offered neither.
So the new entrants who were pioneering hydraulics had to find a new value network, a market where the weakness of the seals simply didn't matter. Where did they go?
They found a completely new emerging application. Entrants like J.C. Bamford in the UK and Sherman Products in the U.S. didn't try to build massive shovels.
What did they do?
They took these small, weak hydraulic backhoes and mounted them onto the back of ordinary, highly mobile farm and industrial tractors.
Just a normal tractor.
Yes.
Yes.
They bypassed the mining companies entirely and marketed them to small residential contractors.
Why residential? What was the macroeconomic shift happening at that time?
Post-World War II and post-Korean War, the United States and the UK experienced a massive housing boom. Suburban tract subdivisions were springing up everywhere.
The suburbs were being built.
Exactly. And to build these, contractors needed to dig millions of narrow, relatively shallow trenches to connect the water and sewer lines from the main street to the individual foundations of these new houses.
And before this hydraulic tractor attachment existed, how were they digging those trenches?
They were digging them largely by hand, with literal shovels and pickaxes.
Your kid!
It was too expensive and logistically impossible to transport a massive track-mounted cable excavator on a flatbed truck into a tight residential subdivision just to dig a small trench.
It's just too big for the job.
Way too big. But a small, highly mobile rubber-tired tractor with a hydraulic backhoe could drive itself down the street, dig the trench in less than an hour, and drive to the next house.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The tractor backhoe is the exact physical equivalent of the 3.5-inch disk drive.
It is.
It's the street taco. It offered a completely different set of attributes. Mobility, the ability to dig a precise, narrow trench, and affordability. It didn't compete on the old metric of volume per scoop. It competed on doing a job that previously couldn't be done mechanically at all.
The parallel is exact. The residential contractors became the new value network. And because these new customers were buying them as affordable attachments for tractors, they were sold through a completely different distribution channel.
Like local dealers.
Local tractor and farm implement dealerships, rather than the highly specialized, high-overhead, heavy equipment sales forces utilized by the big cable excavator companies. The cost structure of the entrance was perfectly aligned with the lower margins of the residential market.
So the trap is perfectly set once again. The massive incumbents are busy building bigger cable machines for the miners. The entrants have secured a profitable, defensible base in residential contracting. Let me guess the trajectory of the next 20 years.
You know exactly the shape of the curve by now. Once the entrants had their profitable base, their engineers went to work on sustaining innovations. They improved the metallurgy of the cylinders.
And made them stronger.
They invented better polymers for the hydraulic seals so they could withstand higher pressures. They improved the pump architectures. The solid line of technological progress shot rapidly upward.
How big did they get?
The maximum bucket size of a hydraulic excavator went from 38 of a yard in 1955 to 2 full yards by 1965. And by 1974, the largest hydraulic excavators could lift 10 cubic yards of earth, matching the power of the massive cable machines, but with greater precision and safety.
They completely devoured the big cable excavator companies from below. They started in the dirt trenches and ended up taking over the mines.
It was an absolute slaughter of the incumbents. Of the 30 or so established dominant manufacturers of cable-actuated equipment operating in the 1950s, only 4 successfully transformed themselves into sustainable hydraulic excavator manufacturers.
Only 4 out of 30 survived.
Yes. Companies like Caterpillar, John Deere, and J.I. Case the entrants who started in the tractor and agricultural markets. They became the new, undisputed titans of the heavy equipment industry. The laws of disruptive innovation acted like gravity.
Wow.
The principles didn't care if the product was a microchip measuring nanometers or a massive machine moving mountains of dirt. The financial mechanics operate identically.
That is just staggering to comprehend. To bring this all together and synthesize the grand takeaway from Christensen's research, doing exactly what you're supposed to do, listening closely to your best customers, rigorously researching market trends, and relentlessly chasing the highest profit margins to keep your shareholders happy, is the exact mechanism that leaves you completely blind and structurally vulnerable to a disruptive attack from below.
The very processes and values that constitute a company's greatest capabilities in one context perfectly define its fatal disabilities in another.
The capabilities become disabilities.
Yes. Small, messy, low-margin, seemingly inferior technologies emerging in unrelated fringe markets are the ultimate existential threat. Because eventually those technologies grow up.
They always grow up.
Their trajectory of improvement is steeper than the market's demand for performance, and they inevitably cross the threshold into the mainstream, destroying the incumbents who are financially caged by their own success.
We've covered the lightning-fast world of disk drives. We've covered the grueling physics of mechanical excavators. But the ultimate lesson here is universal across human endeavor. If you're listening to this right now, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. Look closely at your own career, look at the business you run or the industry you work in right now. What is the current value network you are optimizing your life for?
That's the question you have to ask.
What are the specific metrics of success you are blindly chasing, simply because that's what your best clients or your boss demand from you today?
And more importantly, look down market. What is the messy, low-status, seemingly inferior tool or idea out on the fringe today that you are actively ignoring or mocking? What is the thing that promises lower margins or appeals to a customer base you currently look down upon?
Because if the history of industrial capitalism tells us anything, that slightly inferior, cheaper toy on the fringe today is the behemoth that will inevitably eat your industry tomorrow. Are you a 14-inch disk drive, comfortably spinning away in an air-conditioned mainframe room, completely unaware that you are living in a 3.5-inch world? Think back to that perfect executive we talked about at the very beginning, the one doing everything perfectly right. Maybe it's time to start intentionally doing a few things wrong. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.